Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I am the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts, also in the U.S. for those of you coming in from not in the U.S., because Christopher Morash, who is here for the second time talking about his book, Dublin Writer's City, and he's going to be talking about all about, that's awesome. I love that book, Chris. Is going to be talking all about his book, and this is his second time with us. So we're going to dig deeper into the literati of Dublin and Chris's research into them. So he's going to do a presentation, but before we get to that, a couple things. Thanks to the friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs. We could not do this fun stuff without them. And thanks to Chris for letting us share this program with other libraries who jumped on the chance to be on this program. And so welcome to patrons from those libraries. I'll put a list in the chat after I talk. You can buy signed books by Chris from Aesop's Fable, our favorite indie bookstore. And of course, you can get them from your local library because we have a couple of copies and they're always out. Yeah, I know, it's awesome. So Chris is going to have about a 45 minutes to an hour presentation, and then we'll take a Q&A. I will turn the chat off during the presentation and turn it back on after. If you have questions, though, please put them in the Q&A. That's where I'll be paying attention to those for after the presentation. So Chris, welcome back. I'm so happy to see you, and I hope you've been well this last year.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mina. Yeah, it's been a busy year. I'm working on a new book at the moment on people ask me what I'm working on. It's a book on, I could say it's a literary gossip. It's about literary salons in Dublin, particularly around the beginning of the 20th century. There was a period in Dublin history where you could go out pretty much every night of the week to a different house and somebody would have a literary salon. So that's what's in the works. That's the next book.
When can we expect that?
We're looking at 2025 as a publication date. So
okay, well then for everybody here, you heard him that we'll have him here back again in 2025.
Yeah.
Okay, so Chris, go ahead and tell us about yourself a little bit, and then go right into your presentation. I'm going to go.
Thanks very much, Mina. Yeah. My name's Chris Morash. I am the Seamus Heaney Professor of Irish Writing in Trinity College in Dublin, and I've been writing about various forms of Irish literature for a while now. And the book I published last year, actually almost exactly a year ago, is this book here. Can we get a good light on it? Dublin, a Writer's City. Published at Cambridge University Press. And in some ways, people ask me how long it took me to write this book. And the simple answer is it probably took about a year and a half. The real answer is it probably took around about 35 years or so. It's how long I've been in Dublin. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the experience of being in Dublin and reading it through its literature. So that's where I'm going to go with this. So I'm just going to first of all share some slides, the screen with you, and if nobody can see that, Mina would maybe let me know, but if you can, we're good.
We are good.
We are good. Okay. Yeah, so I call this Dublin, my writer's city. And I want to start off with sort of, where I first began in Dublin. There's the book. Is in when I first landed in Dublin. Now, I don't know if you can tell from the accent, I'm not actually originally from Dublin. I'm actually originally Canadian. I grew up in Nova Scotia. And in 1985, September 1985, I went to Dublin for a year. Didn't work out so well. I ended up staying a bit longer than that. But in 1985, I went to Dublin to study Irish literature. And when I was working on this book, I've been there ever since. When I was working on this book over the last couple of years, I started thinking back to that very first day that I arrived in Dublin, and how my experience of Dublin as a literary city really began from almost the moment I stepped off the plane, but certainly from the moment that I first arrived where I was going to be living. The place where I was going to live was here, Westland Row. In fact, right where that arrow is. Westland Row is in the center of Dublin. It's at the back of the campus of Trinity College. And I'm going to kind of fill you in the geography a bit more. Well, that place where the red arrow is it was 15 Westland Row where I was staying. And when the taxi let me off, and I still remember this, when the taxi let me off at 15 Westland Row, I thought, this address sounds familiar. And not just because I knew I was going to be living there. I had been reading Richard Ellman's biography of Oscar Wilde on the plane on the way over. And it struck me that actually where Oscar Wilde had been born here was 21 Westland Row. So suddenly I realized I was going to be living 6 doors down from where Oscar Wilde was born. Now, in one of those sort of twists of fate that, sounds more fictional than real, 21 Westland Row is now where my office is. My office is in that building. And it's a typical sort of Dublin building, yeah, of that period. It's sort of Georgian, late Georgian, so it was built probably about 1810, 1815. And they're typically 4 stories high, but not very deep. They're about 2 rooms deep. And one day I was in my office, which is on the 3rd floor, right up here. And I started thinking about the rooms in this particular house. And I realized the 2 reception rooms downstairs would have been just that, a reception room and a dining room. That would have been on the ground floor. The next floor up, what in Ireland we call the first floor, rather confusingly, not the ground floor, first floor, was also reception rooms. There's big double doors between the 2 rooms, high ceilings. It was meant for parties, basically. So that would have been reception rooms. And then the floor above that, which is where my office is, has 2 rooms, one along the front here, and then mine at the back. So those would have been the kind of master bedrooms. And I realized the one at the front was the master bedroom, which made the one at the back the nursery. Now, the Wilde family lived in here until 1855, and Oscar Wilde was born in 1854. So that means my office is actually the room that Oscar Wilde had as a baby for a nursery. And all of that personal history, from first arriving in Dublin in 1985 here, to ending up in an office in this building here today, takes you a space, that is only 4 or 5 houses long. It takes you a couple of minutes to walk it. And that density, that closeness of things to one another, that's what I want to kind of really focus on today. To think about how in a city where things are dense, where literature is kind of everywhere around you, and where you walk, how that changes your experience of a city, and how knowing the literature changes your experience of the city. Let's just carry on my first day in Dublin, September 1985. So this was, as I say, that was where I arrived. That was where I ended up. This is what Westland Row looked like, not in 1985, but around the turn of the century. You can see, as a street, it's not a particularly architecturally distinguished street. But when you start to know its stories, you begin to realize that this is a street where there's actually a lot happening in literary terms. So this is the building where I now work. It's actually called the Oscar Wilde Center. There's a little plaque on the outside of it telling you that Wilde lived here. This is 21 Westland Row. There's the man himself. This is where he was born. If you go back to the street and you're looking south, here, there's where Wilde was born, 21 Westland Row. On the day I arrived here, 1985, I'd just been on a transatlantic flight, had a bit of a headache, so I thought, I'm going to find a drugstore, a chemist shop, as we call it here. So I walked down to the end of the street, here, where there is a chemist shop, or there was a chemist shop. Sweeney's chemist shop. And as I was in Sweeney's chemist shop, buying a bit of some aspirin, I thought, I know this. I know Sweeney's chemist shop. And then I thought, how do I know Sweeney's chemist shop? Well, because it's in Ulysses. That Joyce's character, Leopold Bloom, actually goes into Sweeney's chemist shop in Ulysses, where he just waits behind the counter, inhaling the keen reek of drugs. We like get that off there. The dusty, dry smell of sponges and loofahs, or I think it's like a kind of sponge. And later on, of course, Leopold Bloom walks down Westland Row. So this is in James Joyce's Ulysses. In Westland Row, he halted before the window of the Belfast and Oriental Tea Company and read the legends on the lead-papered packets. Choice blend, finest quality, family tea. Rather warm, he thinks to himself. Must get some tea from Tom Kiernan. So I realized that this street that I was living on, not only was it the place where Oscar Wilde was born, it's also features in James Joyce's Ulysses, that it is, one of the sites of Ulysses. Leopold Bloom walks down here, he buys lemon soap for his wife, Molly Bloom, and then he goes down, he looks at tea. So I'm only in Dublin now, at this point for a couple of minutes, really, 10, 20 minutes. Let's continue on. There's the man himself, Joyce. This is Ulysses. Westland Row meant something to Joyce because at the very top of Westland Row, there are these two buildings, these two red brick buildings. Just as you come to the top of the street, turn right, literally right there. One is the Dublin Dental Hospital, which I'll come to in a moment. And the one beside it was in 1904, Finn's Hotel. Now, why is 1904 important? Well, Joyce's Ulysses, which you may well know, is all set, in spite of its size, is all set in one day, 16th of June, 1904. And that was the day that Joyce himself met the woman who became his wife, Nora Barnacle, who was working at the time in Finn's Hotel. And he met her outside Finn's Hotel, and they went for a walk, and that was their first date. And so when he set about writing his great novel, he decided he's going to set it on one day. And the day on which he set it was the day that he wanted to memorialize their meeting, 16th of June, 1904. And that was literally the top of the street where I was living. Okay, so here we are. We're at the top of Westland Row. You see Sweeney's chemist shop over there on the left. What else do we have? There's Sweeney's. On the other side of the street is a pub. It's Dublin. Of course, there's a pub. Kennedy's. Now, it took me a little while to figure this one out, but then I started reading some Samuel Beckett. Maybe not so much the plays that he's better known for, and that he was probably really won the Nobel Prize for, but his fiction. And there's a collection of stories he wrote early on in his career called More Pricks Than Kicks. And there's a story in it called A Wet Night, which involves a character making his way up, you guessed it, Westland Row, going into Kennedy's, having rather too much to drink, and then coming back out just around the corner to your right at the Dublin Dental Hospital. This is what he encounters along the way. Two banned novelists, a bibliomaniac and his mistress, a chorus of playwrights, the inevitable envoy of the Fourth Estate, a phalanx of Grafton Street stormers. Grafton Street is a fashionable street in Dublin, just a couple of blocks away from here, and Jemmy Higgins, who I've never quite identified. This is the character, Balakwa. He says he comes out of the pub and he's a bit too much to drink. He says, Balakwa keyed up to take his bearings. You can imagine him coming out of the pub and trying to orient himself. Issued forth into the unintelligible world of Lincoln Place. The area at the very top of Westland Row is called Lincoln Place. He set forth unsteadily by the dental hospital, which actually today forms the southern part of the Trinity campus, and I'll get to that in a minute. As a child, he had dreaded its facade, its sheets of blood-red glass. Now they were brick, which was worse again, he having put aside a childish thing or two. So there he is, Beckett. So let's just think for a moment. I'm only in Dublin at this point, maybe 10, 15 minutes, and I've just passed the house where Oscar Wilde was born. I've identified two important places for James Joyce, one from the scene in Ulysses, the other where he actually meets Molly Bloom. And I've actually popped into the pub where Beckett sets one of his early short stories. Three big writers. Let's see, can we find a fourth? If this is back in Westland Row, you recognize where we are here. This is the Oscar Wilde Centre. So you're starting to know your way around Dublin now. Go down Westland Road to the north. and you come to a street called Pier Street. Now, if you go just a little way down Pier Street, cross over Pier Street, you come to Lombard Street, you go past another building that is in Ulysses, and you see they actually have on the side of it, and past Nichols the Undertaker, Ulysses James Joyce. It's still there, Nichols the Undertaker. But let's get, we're at the very end of Westland Road. Look to our left, and you see this building, now called the Academy. In 1899, the Academy was called the Ancient Concert Rooms. It was a place you could rent, a venue, had a theater, had a stage. It hosted musical recitals. James Joyce, who had a rather good tenor voice, actually had a recital there. But more important in terms of Irish literary history is that on May 13th, 1899, this is where the very first production of the Irish Literary Theatre was held. Right there. And the people who founded the Irish Literary Theatre, W.B. Yeats, Lady Augusta Gregory, and a man probably less well known, Edward Martyn. The three founders of the theatre that become the Abbey Theatre today, which is, well known around the world. So there he is. Actually, I have a copy of this myself. This is his play, The Countess Kathleen, that is staged in the Ancient Concert Rooms, May 13th, 1899. It provokes a minor riot. It involves a character who's an aristocrat who decides that during a famine, she will sell her soul to the devil in order to save her peasants, her tenants who are dying of hunger. She sacrifices her soul, and then an angel appears at the end and says she is redeemed because the shadow of shadow looks only on the deeds, but the light of lights looks on the motive. And so she rises up into heaven. Quite a strange and wonderful play. And that's where it was staged in 1899. In fact, here's what it looked like in 1899. Now, that play may not be as important in its own right as what follows from it, because this is what starts off the Abbey Theatre, which still exists today and is still Ireland's national theatre. And Yeats, writing a few years later, has a very clear sense that what he's doing is actually starting a literary movement. We have turned, he says, a great deal of Irish imagination towards the stage. We could not have done this if our movement had not opened the way of expression for an impulse that was in the people themselves. The truth is that the Irish people are at that precise stage of their literary history when imagination, shaped by many stirring events, desires dramatic expression. So this is an important site in Irish literary history, Irish theatrical history. So let's think about this for a moment. Here's a map, help you orient it. There's the Wild Centre, where my office is. Right here is where I first lived when I came to Dublin in 1985. That's how close the Ancient Concert Rooms are, just literally around the corner. There's Sweeney's Chemists. On the corner here is Kenny's Pub and the Dental Hospital and Finn's Hotel. Finn's Hotel is literally right there. All of that is in that close proximity. And it's this idea of proximity that I really want to try and explore today, because what proximity gives you is a sense of historical layers. I want to read a poem for you. This is by the Irish poet Louis MacNeice. And he wrote it in 1939, just literally on the eve of the Second World War. And he wasn't from Dublin. At one point in the poem, he basically says, this was never my town. I was not born nor bred nor schooled here, and she will not have me alive nor dead. Yet she holds my mind with her seedy elegance, her gentle veils of rain, and all her ghosts that walk behind. All the ghosts that walk and all that hide behind her Georgian facades. But there's something in this poem I want to read to you that really, I think, will help underlie what I'm doing with this talk. Let me just read you the first and last stanzas of Louis MacNeice's Dublin. And apologies for that little message that keeps coming up. I changed this something on my software a couple of weeks ago and it persists. Anyway, Louis MacNeice, Dublin. Grey brick upon brick, declamatory bronze on sombre pedestals. O'Connell, Grattan, Moore. And the brewery tugs and the swans on the balustraded stream, and the bare bones of a fanlight over a hungry door, and the air soft on the cheek, and porter running from the taps with a head of yellow cream, and Nelson on his pillar watching his world collapse. And then he goes on to kind of try to recover from the sense of Dublin as being a slightly run-down looking city. Grey brick upon grey brick, bare bones of a fanlight. What it is that is fascinating, why it holds his imagination. Here's what he says. Fort of the Dane, garrison of the Saxon, Augustan capital of a Gaelic nation, appropriating all the alien brought. You gave me time for thought, and by a juggler's trick you poised the toppling hour. O greyness run to flower, grey stone, grey water, and brick upon grey brick. Fort of the Dane, garrison of the Saxon. Dublin was founded by Vikings in the 8th century, 9th century, actually, 831 is first date we actually know. Garrison of the Saxon. Dublin, of course, was the capital of Ireland under British rule. Augustan capital of a Gaelic nation. It was ruled by the British, even though most of the rest of the country was Gaelic. Appropriating all the alien brought, you gave me time for thought, and by a juggler's trick, you poised the toppling hour. The sense that the world's just about to fall apart. He wrote this poem in 1939, actually September 1939. Oh, greyness run to flower, grey stone, grey water, and brick upon grey brick. The sense that there are kind of layers of history all existing simultaneously in very close proximity to one another, allows you to think about where you are at the moment, where you are, particularly perhaps at a moment of crisis. And I think that's one of the keys to the experience of Dublin as a literary city. So what I want to do now is, having introduced you to my first day in Dublin, let's go into the place I work, Trinity College Dublin, which is literally at the back of the first place I lived and where my office is. So I'm going to take you for a little walk around the campus. This is what an aerial view of the campus looks like. The 3 arrows there on your right, that's where the ancient concert room is, where the, or was, where the first production of the Abbey was held. That's the Wild Centre, that's the Wild's house. There's Sweeney's Chemist Shop, just to orient yourself. And you can see, it's a very short distance, you can kind of walk your way in. There's the rugby pitch, there's the cricket pitch, there's the squares of the campus, and right here is the front gate. This arrow here in the middle is a library. We couldn't not mention the library, and we'll come back to the library. So you're approaching Trinity from the other side. This is what it looks like. Well, this is what it looked like in terms of the traffic, but the front of it still looks like that. In Joyce's Ulysses, you can't talk about Dublin as a literary city without talking about this book. In Joyce's Ulysses, in another chapter, the Laestrygonians episode, the character of Leopold Bloom is walking along the front part of the campus. And he's walking literally right through there. And now I deliberately have this old picture where it's full of buses. It's still a bus corridor, and there's still a tram that runs through there. And his smile faded as he walked, a heavy cloud hiding the sun, slowly shadowing Trinity's surly front. Trams passed one another, ingoing, outgoing, clanging, useless words, things the same, things go on day after day. Squads of police marching out back, trams in, trams out. And the motion of the trams, of the traffic crossing one another, trams going one way, trams going another, starts him thinking about the city as a place that has a kind of history, and a history that is constantly renewing itself. And it's a sense that when you walk down a city street, I'm sure we've all had this experience, When you walk down a city street, on one hand, the street looks very permanent. It's brick, it's stone, it's glass, it's tarmac. But on the other hand, we know that cities change, that the offices change, buildings change, stores change. So that sense that the city is always itself, but constantly in flux. And I've never found that captured more eloquently or beautifully than in this passage from Ulysses. Cityful passing away, other cityful coming, passing away too, other coming on, passing on. Houses, lines of houses, streets, miles of pavement, piled up bricks, stones, changing hands. This owner, that. Landlord never dies, they say. Other steps up, other steps into his shoes when he gets his notice to quit. They buy up the place with gold, and still they have all the gold. Swindle in it somewhere. Piled up cities worn away age after age. And the line after that is pyramids in the sand. That sense that a city is constantly in flux, constantly renewing itself, constantly adding layers, is something I think we all have experienced in cities. But we experience it particularly strongly in Dublin because so many of the buildings are still the same. So that sense that there are earlier periods of history coexisting with the present are very much part of the literature and part of our experience of the city. That's really what I'm interested in. It's our experience of the city. Let's keep walking past. We haven't got into Trinity yet, just walking along past the front gate. You go a little bit past it, there's another entrance, and this is the provost's house. In Ulysses, again, Leopold Bloom, thinking to himself, says, Provost's house, the Reverend Dr. Salmon. And that was the provost's name at the time. Tinned salmon, he says. Well tinned in there. Wouldn't live in it if you paid me. And the provost, our current provost, Linda Doyle, computer scientist, still lives in there. And in Joyce's, one of his other novels, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, he describes it this way. The grey block of Trinity on his left sat heavily in the city's ignorance, like a great dull stone set in a cumbersome ring. Joyce, by the way, didn't go to Trinity, so he has a certain arm's length relationship. Now, one of the things you'll notice both here and here is that the campus is completely surrounded by walls. And this gives it a particular quality if you visit Dublin, because it's in the center of the city. You couldn't get any more central than where the campus is. And yet you have this completely enclosed space. And I can't think of another university campus like it. There are city center campuses, think of something like NYU in New York, which is kind of spread all over existing buildings. There are walled campuses, any of the kind of Oxford or Cambridge colleges are like that. But a walled campus in the middle of a capital city, I'm hard pressed to think of another example, and it gives it a particular quality. There's a lovely novel published a couple of years ago by Louise Nealon, who was a student of English in Trinity, actually. And it's sort of autofiction, where she writes about being a student of English in Trinity. But there's a lovely passage early on in it where she grows up in a farm in rural Ireland, and she's thinking about going to the university. And she walks into the city with her uncle, who's a farmer, dairy farmer. And they look at the walls. And she says, I don't think this is her uncle, realized that it was open to the public. I always thought of Trinity as a reverse Shawshank Redemption situation, where you had to bribe Morgan Freeman with cigarettes and tunnel your way in. It's a lovely passage. Just in passing, we talk about libraries. You'll notice on the cover of this book, and I've put the logo over here as well, it says One Dublin, One Book. One of the things Dublin City Library does every year is picks a book that is the One Dublin, One Book. And for a year, the idea is everybody in the city reads the same book. There are a number of events. Louise herself will be doing events around the city. There'll be talks, there'll be discussions, there'll be various kinds of public events. And in fact, there are public events outside of Dublin as well. But it's the idea that as a city, you can actually create a community of readers by having everybody read the same book. And in this place, quite nicely, her publisher, Manila Press, got behind it and have done a special edition you can see with the One Dublin, One Book logo. So in a sense, that's, again, one of the things that makes a literary city. Um, the one last year was called The Coroner's Daughter, was a historical crime novel. Um, let's move on. So let's go inside the gates. So there's the front gate, and you can see why Louise Nealon's uncle in the novel kind of thought of Trinity as a place that, you had to bribe Morgan Freeman with cigarettes to get into. Let's go through that gate, follow the person with the knapsack. The reason it has a gate, before we get in the gate, is because when Trinity was first built in 1592, it was on the very outskirts of Dublin. This is a map of Dublin, 1610. 18 years after the city was built. This is the original walled city. And this over here, number 12, right at the edge of the map, was the college. So it was built as a kind of walled compound outside the city. And even though the city has moved eastwards and now Trinity is the center of the city, that sense of being a kind of walled enclosure still persists. Here's a passage from a little-known novel from 1906 by a writer named George Birmingham, Hyacinth, but I think it gives you a really lovely sense of what happens when you leave the trams and the buses and just the sheer noise and energy of that city center, city full passing away, other city coming on, as Bloom puts it in Ulysses. You pass through the gate and you come into this main square, Parliament Square it's called, or Front Square is what everybody calls it. In Dublin, this is from Hyacinth, in Dublin, a man, or could be a woman, leaves the city behind him when he enters the college, passes completely out of the atmosphere of the university when he steps onto the pavement. This sense of going through that gate, you sort of moving between two worlds. The rattle of traffic, the jangling of cart bells, the inarticulate babel of voices suddenly cease when the archway of the great entrance gate is passed. An immense silence takes their place. And it's true, you pass through that gate and it's like the atmosphere changes. You're suddenly somewhere else. This is the writer Oliver St. John Gogarty. Now, he's a friend of Yeats, friend of Joyce, actually, very good friend of Joyce. Writes some lovely autobiographical stuff, including this book called As I Was Walking Down Sackville Street. And he kind of has that same sense. He says, the way through front gate divides the great quad of Trinity College, which opens on a large cobbled space. Now, as you come through the gate, this is what you're looking at, this kind of tower, which is called the Campanile. In the lawn of each stands a great oak. Old grey houses with windows framed in lighter stone shelter the immense trees. In front, the graceful Campanile, this is the tower, stands between the library, which is over here. We have to mention the library, and we're going to go into the library, and the Graduates Memorial Building, which is on the left over here. We're going to go into there as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you on a kind of virtual walking tour, literary walking tour around Dublin, around Trinity. One of the things that I tried to do with my book on Dublin as a writer's city was not just to kind of put together, literary references around the place, but to think about the ways in which writers writing about the same place over the years, a bit like think of that Louis MacNeice poem, Grey Brick Upon Grey Brick. Writers writing about the same things over a long period of years capture something similar, a kind of atmosphere. And the atmosphere, the quality that I started to notice in writing about Trinity had to do with the nature of the space. And this is, I think, interesting because it tells us that the kinds of urban spaces we create have an effect on our culture, we know that, and on our literary culture. That the kinds of urban spaces we create shape our literary culture, but they also allow certain things. And one of the things they allow in Trinity, I think, is conversation. That you're in the street, there's trams, there's buses, there's noise, there's hustle, there's bustle, and you go through the gate, it's quiet, and you can talk. And one of the provosts of Trinity, one of the men who lived people who lived in that provost's house was this man here, John Pentland Mahaffy. He was the provost around about 1900, but before he was the provost, he was Oscar Wilde's tutor and lecturer. He was a professor of classics. But the book he wrote that I find most interesting, and I have a copy of it here, is a book he published in 1887 called Principles of the Art of Conversation, where he says there can be no doubt that of all the accomplishments prized in modern society, that of being agreeable in conversation is the first. And he basically goes through the ways to be a good conversationalist. And one of the things I find fascinating with this is he has a section here on what he calls conditions too general, moral worth and truthfulness. He says, there's such a thing, and he's a classicist, so he has to add Aristotle saw it long ago, as being over-scrupulous in truthfulness when we are indulging in the relaxation of easy conversation. Even a consummate liar, though generally vulgar, and therefore offensive, will contribute more pleasantly to conversation than the scrupulously truthful man who weighs every statement, questions every fact, and corrects every inaccuracy. In the presence of such a social scourge, I have heard a witty talker pronounce it, the golden rule of conversation is to know nothing accurately. Far more important it is, in my mind, to demand no accuracy. And it goes on. But here's somebody thinking, what is it that makes good conversation? He says, well, no, you don't have to be completely truthful. But it's much better to, bend the facts a bit rather than be the person who weighs every single statement and says, well, no, that's not exactly right. That's not exactly right, and so on. So here's somebody thinking about conversation as an art. And in a way, that is what happens inside this space of Trinity. Conversation becomes an art. And that in turn leads to a very certain kind of writing. Now, keep in mind here, this man, John Pentland Mahaffy, was Oscar Wilde's tutor. So, if you know Wilde's work, they're all about the art of conversation. But it goes back before that. And this is what I mean by these layers of history. Here's Jonathan Swift, who was a student in Trinity much earlier, back in the early 18th century. And, he, among the many things he wrote this wonderful poem on his own death, verses on the death of Dr. Swift, which includes this stanza, suppose me dead, and then suppose a club assembled at the Rose, which was a tavern, where from discourse of this and that, I grow the subject of their chat. So, here's a writer imagining himself dead, but the thing he imagines is how will people talk about him? Talk, conversation, the key thing. And part of that crystallizes around this building, the Graduate Memorial Building, which is where the two debating societies in the college are based, the Phil, or Philosophical Society, and the Hist, or Historical Society. Last week, I did an interview with a podcast for BBC Travel, and they have this series where they do, I don't know, the 7 things you have to eat in Singapore, or the 7, 8, or 5 churches you have to see in Venice, or the top 5, 6, this and that in various cities. And they asked me to pick out the kind of 5 or 6 literary things you need to do in Dublin. And I picked a couple of obvious ones, Joyce's Martello Tower in Sandy Cove and a few others. But I picked this, which nobody would have guessed, the Graduate Memorial Building. And you're going to see why in a moment. The Debating Society, the Historical Society, or HIST, was founded by this man, Edmund Burke, in the 18th century. And Burke, as well as being a philosopher and as well as being an orator and politician, a great speaker, is the originator of one of the ideas of art that has been profoundly influential, the idea of the sublime, that things that overwhelm or frighten us can give us artistic pleasure. Mountains, storms at sea, even horror comes out of his theory of the sublime. And he came up with this theory of the sublime when he was a student, which is kind of scary, really, in Trinity in 1745. And he was living in rooms that were a little off the campus along the River Liffey. And the river flooded. And there was, he describes it. He says, though everything around me conspires to incite in me a contrary disposition, the melancholy gloom of the day, the whistling winds, the hoarse rumblings of the swollen Liffey, with the flood which even I, where I write, lays close siege on our whole street. And he describes, like the bodies of dogs and trees and bits of rubbish of all kinds kind of being swept along in this filthy water that's rising up around his windows. And he's writing. He says, yet the joy of conversing with my friend can dispel the cloudiness of the day, lull the winds, and stop the rapid passage of the flood. How do you deal with a situation that is overwhelming or is frightening? You talk to your friends. And when I was writing my Dublin Writer City book, I thought, how do I link Burke to the present? And I made what in film terms would be called a jump cut. I went from Burke to not Stoker, but to Sally Rooney. Because Sally Rooney was also a member, actually an auditor, of the same debating society in the 21st century. And of course, she has a novel entitled Conversation with Friends. But she's not the only writer who was a member or a major figure in the debating society. Oscar Wilde was, and as was one of Oscar Wilde's contemporaries and a friend of his, Bram Stoker, the man who wrote Dracula. So there in this same building, this is gray stone upon gray stone, you have layers. You have Edmund Burke, 18th century philosopher of the sublime. You have Oscar Wilde, wit, 19th century, and Bram Stoker, Gothic writer of the 19th century, and Sally Rooney, iconic writer of the 21st century, whose announcement of her latest novel is kind of news everywhere. Of course, her novel Normal People is actually set in Trinity for a large part. And there's a piece in the novel where her main character, Marianne, is in the library. And there's this wonderful description of being in the library. And I think, we have to talk about libraries now for a few minutes. I like to sit in the library to write essays, allowing my sense of time and personal identity to dissolve as the light dimmed outside the windows. I mostly forgot to eat on days like this and emerged in the evening with a fine, shrill headache. When I couldn't make friends as a child, I fantasized that I was a genius, hidden among normal people. It made me feel like a spy. And, this is where she takes the title of the novel from this moment, this scene where Marianne is in the Trinity Library. And let's go into the library. The library that actually has a little over 1 million visitors a year. At the moment, the old library doesn't look like this because we're in the process of finally doing some renovations. It was built in 1735. We now have, let's say, approximately 1 million visitors a year, and a wholly inadequate sprinkler system. So all the books are now out. There's a state-of-the-art sprinkler and alarm system being put in it, and over a period of years, they'll be gradually put back together. But this actually is the library that Marianne, Sally Rooney's character, is in. This is the Berkeley Library. Well, it's not called the Berkeley Library anymore because we've denamed it because it turned out that Bishop Berkeley actually was a slave owner. This is what it looked like when it was originally built with no name on it. This is what it looked like for a while when it had Berkeley's name on it. And this is a poem a friend of mine wrote about it called Plinth, Berkeley Library, Trinity College, before it was denamed. Pomodoro's Sphere Within Sphere, that's the sculpture right in the front. The classical printing house, the river-inflected sky, and then recall the chatter and the everlasting laughter. And again, what do you do here? It's a place for conversation, a place in the center of the city where you can talk. Let's go into the old library, though, because the old library is full of ghosts of all sorts, literary ghosts, but I just want to pick up on one in particular. In the 19th century, one of the people who worked in the library was a poet named James Clarence Mangan. Now, Mangan is a fascinating figure. He had substance abuse issues, alcohol, and probably morphine. Well, not probably, certainly morphine or opium. And he would disappear for days at a time. But he also managed to write a huge volume of poetry. And uh, he also worked in the library here in Trinity, and he was cataloging those very books you see there. So you would still call down books from the library with librarians' call numbers written on them by hand in Mangan's hand. That's picture on the right there is his death mask. That's what he looked like. And it's the kind of poetry he wrote. Tell how this nameless, condemned for years long to herd with demons from hell beneath, saw things that made him with groans and tears long even for death. And he lived in this whole series of addresses in the old medieval part of the city. But look at how he describes one of them. These dens, he describes the house he lived in, one of which was over the other, were mutually connected by means of a steep and almost perpendicular ladder, down which it was my fortune to receive many a tumble from time to time upon the sloppy earthen floor beneath. Door or window there was none to the lower chamber, the place of the latter in particular being supplied, not very elegantly, by a huge chasm in the bare and broken wall. And so there's, this description of this incredibly dilapidated building that he lived in. Let's go to well, maybe not quite out of the library. Before we go to fully out of the library, I want to just bring you a poem here by a colleague of mine. She's still an emeritus professor. And I want to use this as a way of bringing us from the library to one of the student residences, Botany Bay. This is Eileen Killinon, who is a poet, academic, scholar. And she has been writing poetry since the late 1960s. Eileen Quillanon's most recent book, published in 2019, is called The Mother House. And there's a poem in it that I always think, if we're doing a talk in libraries, we have to read. The Bookshelves. These are our cliffs where we hang and grope and slide. Why should there be a path upwards among such casual stacks? Somebody shelve them size by size, but still they signal throbbing on shadowy types. Their lightning blazes like a faraway headlight, bound firmly elsewhere. Most times, it's a finger tucked in the big dictionary that leads onwards, as if under submerged voiture, a long damp paving to the ancient reservoir to tell us that the jumping flashes on the rock face were the codes for a name that we could never have otherwise known. Eileen's poetry is complex, and I'm not going to fully parse this for you, but I think what you also can do with her poetry is just simply take that sense from it, that sense of wonder in the face of shelf full of books. The bookshelves, they are our cliffs. And I think, they are our cliffs. And the library really is the heart of Trinity, the heart of the campus. But let's go back to this idea of it as a place for talk. I use this as a way to kind of start to move toward a conclusion. Eileen started working in Trinity in the mid-1960s. And when she started as a young academic, there was a whole generation, really the major generation of Irish poets were there as students. One of them was Michael Longley, who's still alive, and he had, like others, rooms in the buildings you see behind him, Botany Bay, which is just behind the Graduate Memorial Building. See, you're getting the way you know your way around campus. And he describes, later on in life, he describes what it was like being a student there at the time. We inhaled with our untipped sweet Afton cigarettes McNeice, who I started out with, Crane, Dylan Thomas, Yeats, Larkin, Lawrence, Graves, Ted Hughes, Stevens, Cummings, Richard Wilbur. Cummings, I probably should have written with the lowercase c, the American poet E. E. Cummings used all lowercase. Robert Lowell, as well as Rimbaud, Baudelaire, Brecht, Rilke, higgledy-piggledy in any order. We scanned the journals and newspapers for poems written yesterday. It captures this sense of excitement of what it was like to be a student in Trinity in the 1960s as part of a generation who would become some of the major poets in Ireland over the next 50 years, such as Derek Mahon. looking particularly grumpy in that picture. He's actually quite a nice man. Um, this is one of Mahon's poems. He was from Belfast. He came to Dublin to study. We have had time to talk and strongly disagree about the living out of life. Now, that just sums it up, doesn't it? We have had time to talk and strongly disagree about the living out of life. There is no need to shout. Rightly, or else quite wrongly, we have run out of time, if not of talk. Let us then cavalierly fork our ways, since we, and all unknown, have called into question one another's own. He calls this Dublin versus Belfast. Now, among his contemporaries in Trinity at that time was, say, Longley, who we've just met. Longley writes later on about being a student in Trinity. This is 1995. He writes this 30 years later. And it's like he's remembering back. And again, it's this sense of historical layers all in the same place. I am walking backwards into the future like a Greek. I have nothing to say. There's nothing I would describe. It was always thus, as if snow had fallen on front square, and feeling the downy silence of the snowflakes that cover cobbles and each other, white erasing white, I read shadow and snowdrift under the Campanalia. And again, there's just the Campanalia. And this is what it looks like on a rare occasion that we actually get snow. But that sense of timelessness, of somehow this being a scene that looked the same in 1960, 1860, 1760, that in some ways you are kind of stepping not just out of the flow of the city full passing away, another city coming on, but that you're stepping out of time. I want to finally bring you to a poet who was also contemporary of these writers, and that's Ivan Boland. In my last year, this should be in my last year in college, I set out to write an essay on the art of rhetoric. I had yet to find the country already lost to me in song and figure as I scribbled down names for sweet euphony and safe digression. And when I came to the word insinuate, I saw that language could writhe and creep in the lore of snakes, which I had learned as a child not to fear, because the saint had sent them out of Ireland, came nearer. This sense of learning language, of being an apprenticeship to language as a student, sort of first arriving in university. And there is another of her poems where she also evokes this sense of college. I just want to read this to you as well. It's not on the screen. It's called City of Shadows. When I saw my father buttoning his coat at front gate, right? So you know what front gate looks like. I thought he would look like a man who had lost what he had. And he did. Grafton Street and Nassau Street were gone. They're the streets that adjoined the campus. And the old Parliament at College Green, and the bronze arms and attitudes of orators from Grattan to O'Connell, all gone. I went to his car. He got in. I waved my hand and motioned him to turn his wheel towards the road, to the only straight route out to the coast. When he did, I walked beside the car, beside the curb, and we made our way in dark inches to the Irish Sea. It's a poem of mourning in a way, walking beside the car evoking a funeral. Then I smelled salt and heard the foghorn, and realized suddenly that I had brought my father to his destination. I walked home, alone, to my flat. The fog was lifting slowly. I thought, whatever the dawn made clear, in cast iron and adamant again, I would know from now on that in a lost land of orators and pedestals and corners and street names and rivers, where even the ground underfoot was hidden from view, there had been one way out, and I had found it. And I'll use that idea of one way out to bring us to the very last thing I want to read for you. This is by a poet who was also contemporary of Ivan Boland and Michael Longley and Derek Mahon. This is Brendan Kennelly, who subsequently went on to work in the college. He only passed away a few years ago. And this is one of his poems called Begin. It's one of Ireland's favorite poems, actually. Shows up regularly on kind of polls for such things. Begin again to the summoning birds, to the sight of light at the window. Begin to the roar of morning traffic all along Pembroke Road. And Pembroke Road's road, not too far from the campus. But he ends the poem with this line. I think it's probably a good way to end anything. Though we live in a world that dreams of ending, that always seems about to give in, something that will not acknowledge conclusion insists that we forever begin. I think that's just a lovely way to end anything. That idea of in your ending is your beginning, in your beginning is your ending. And I suppose the idea I'll leave you with is that in a place like Dublin, particularly in somewhere like Trinity, we have so many layers of history all present at the same time. What literature and what books can do is bring us that sense of all time being sort of present at once. And that gives us, I think, a particular perspective on the present. But it also gives us a particular richness of urban experience. And that's, I suppose, what I'm interested in is how literature allows us to live more richly. So I'm going to leave it there, get rid of my slide share, and turn back over to Mina.
Hello. That was amazing, of course, because it just brings in so many of our interests. And of course, I could listen to you reading poetry all day long. So thank you for that. I want to remind everybody that you can put your questions in the Q&A. We're going to go for another 15 minutes or so we can get to some questions. And I have opened up the chat for you to chat with each other as well. Chris, as we wait for questions to come in, I wanted to kind of talk to you about your complete understanding of how writers, authors, bookstores, teachers, all of those things really come into play to make writing and publishing and getting the word about things integral, right? Like they're all interconnected somehow. Where did you like really get that sense of interconnectivity to make writing so well known to the readers?
Um, yeah, it's a good question. Um, I mean, Dublin is a kind of funny city. It still kind of operates on a Bush telegraph, I think. It's like there's a book's coming out and everybody kind of seems to know about it. And I'm still not completely sure about how all that happens. I do think it has something to do with that quality that makes Ulysses possible 100 years ago. Um, and that is the center of Dublin is a walking city.
Mm.
People walk around. I mean, if I step out of the campus and I go to any of the streets around, chances are pretty much most times a day I will bump into somebody who I know or who knows me. And if there's a bookstore, Hodges Figus bookstore, a few minutes away from the campus. I go into Hodges Figus and I bump into somebody I know or somebody who knows me, and it just it's that kind of place.
Mhm.
Events like this happen quite regularly. I'm always humbled and delighted. I give a talk on a wet Wednesday night in February, and there's like 120 people in the room, and you think, "Wow, what kind of city is this?" So I think in some ways that kind of literary culture perpetuates itself, that it creates its own audience, that there are people who are used to this happening, so they're constantly, they're constantly kind of interacting. But Dublin is unusual. I mean, I know from talking to publishers, they'll say that books that will not generally have a kind of trade sale, a sale to a kind of general readership elsewhere, will sell unexpected numbers here.
Mhm.
Irish history, you know, I mean, the editor I work with in Cambridge always tells a story about this book they published, which was a military history of Ireland, which was heavy enough to use as a kind of offensive weapon, a very big, thick thing. And they sold, I forget how many copies, but they sold way more than they ever thought. They went to about a fourth or fifth print run. No, they thought it was going to be a niche book that libraries would buy alone. Not at all. They sold a lot of them. And
Wow.
so it is that kind of city. It's a city where people do buy books and read books and talk about books.
Mhm. That's really fascinating. And at some point, not right now, because we are getting some questions, I'd love to talk about how to make that happen elsewhere. Is it something
Yeah.
that happens organically, or is it something that we can create?
Yeah. And I think that is a good question. And I think, I mean, one of the things I always try to kind of include as a kind of almost subtext in a talk like this one is the sense that it is partly about space. That if you create urban spaces where people can walk, and increasingly, Dublin is a cycling city now, which it wasn't up until 3 or 4 years ago. Uh, you bump into people and you have those conversations happen,
Mm,
in a way that doesn't tend to happen in cities if you're in your car.
mhm.
So it can start with things like urban design, but there's more to it than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Okay, so what is the name of the BBC travel podcast you mentioned?
Oh, it's I tell you what I'll do. They're timing it to come out in St. Patrick's week, or around St. Patrick's Day, which is the week
Okay,
after next. Um, when I get a link for it, I'll send it to you, Mina, and you can share it. How about that?
that
It's
sounds good.
yeah.
But what was the name of it though? Do you remember?
Oh, what was it? What's it called? I think it's just I don't know that I forget the name of it. I mean,
Okay.
the woman who was doing the interview would contact me and we had a chat and um
Okay,
forget.
that's fine. Yeah, I'll send out the link to anybody
Yeah, yeah.
listening today. And who are the modern writers of Dublin that are contributing to the city's art base?
Oh, the modern writers in Dublin. Yeah, I mean, I deliberately picked, people like, well, Louise Nealon, Sally Rooney. I mean, the Sally Rooney effect has been huge. I
Mhm.
mean, we're normal people in conversations with friends, in particular, were, such big novels globally. Uh, yeah, I mean, we've seen a bump in the number of people applying to do English as visiting students in Trinity, where those novels are about students of English in Trinity. So, but that I think the sale of those books, I mean, Sally Rooney's books have sold about 3 million books worldwide. If you're a young writer like Louise Nealon, who grew up in a farm in rural Ireland, went to Trinity, wrote a novel while on the foot of actually doing a creative writing program, um, you suddenly a publisher is interested because they're looking at it. You can even look at the kind of cover design of this. It's very normal people-y, that normal people have this kind of these solid colors. So there are a number of women, young women, women in the 20s and 30s. Meg Nolan's another one, who are Emer McBride, a little bit older, but same sort of generation, who are writing the city in really interesting ways.
Mm.
And then, there are people like Roddy Doyle, who's been at it for 30 years, has been writing back to novels like, The Commitments or, The Van back in the early 1990s, still writing about Dublin in really, really interesting ways. And the other big area, which I haven't even gone near, is crime fiction.
Yes.
Ireland has had a fictional crime wave for the last. And in fact, I mean, one of the great crime writers of Maine, John Connolly, is a graduate of English in Trinity and lives mostly in Dublin. So, I mean, I know John; he's great, but most of his stuff's set in Maine. So there's just such a range happening.
Mhm. There seems to be a lot of crime fiction going on in Maine for some reason as well. So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Carol asks, what inspired you to leave Canada for Dublin specifically rather than Oxford, Cambridge,
That's a good
those other
question.
places?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, I think at the time I was interested in why a place like Ireland in the 1980s, which was quite economically depressed. Now it's been, kind of booming for the last 25 years or so, but in the 1980s, it was a pretty grim place in lots of ways, was continuing to produce so much literature. And the part of Canada I grew up in Eastern Canada, Nova Scotia, was also struggling economically, but wasn't producing the literature. And I was interested in what is it that you have one place on one side of the Atlantic with a strong sense of its own tradition that is not as literarily, or it is not developing literature in the same way that another one is.
Mhm.
And I've never answered that question. I've been at it for 40 years and I still haven't answered the question, but
Well, I mean, now you get to hang out at the Trinity College Library, which is
yeah,
gorgeous. And
yeah, yeah.
Although you could have ended up at the Bodleian, right?
That's right. It could have been. Yeah, yeah.
Carol also asked, did Seamus Heaney teach at Trinity? Did you include him in your book, or was there a reason you did not include him in your presentation?
Oh, well, I didn't include him in the present. He didn't teach in Trinity. He studied in Queen's University in Belfast. I mean, he held professorship in Harvard, and he actually held one for a short period, a temporary one in Oxford as well. He's in the book because he lived in Dublin. I mean, even though he grew up in rural Ireland for most of his life, he actually lived in Dublin in a place called Sandymount, which is oh yeah, I mean you get from Trinity to Sandymount on the internal tram line in about 20 minutes, you know. So that's where he lived most of his life.
Mhm.
So no, he's never written anything about Trinity. So that's I was trying to just keep things that were about Trinity or from Trinity. But
Mhm.
he's in the book. He's all over the book.
Yeah, but you are actually, I was just looking at your bio again, that you're the Seamus Heaney
Right.
Professor of Irish Writing at
Yeah.
Trinity
That's
College?
right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the chair that I hold is was named to honor Seamus. It was largely endowed by an American philanthropist, man named Mark Pickett,
Yeah.
who owns the company that owned Daft Trucks. Every time you see a great big truck going down the road, I, I always applaud. And he wanted to honor Seamus Heaney. So in 2013, he created this chair, and I took it up just the week that Heaney died, actually, is he passed away in August 2013. And that was literally the point at which I took up the chair. So yeah, and it's always kind of felt like a responsibility. I mean, I would have had quite a bit of interaction with the Heaney family since, you know, because this is important. They're honoring their husband and father, you know, they want to make sure, you know, I was doing a reasonably good job of it, which I hope I have.
It sounds like you have.
Mm.
Maureen asked in the chat about the great crime writers. So Krista had offered to send me a presentation he made just on crime fiction in Dublin. So I'll send that out in the recap to everybody.
Yeah.
I'm not sure this is your bailiwick, but somebody asks, who are the modern musicians that draw from Dublin's history?
Um, ooh, well, there's depends depends on the kind of music you're interested in. And so I'll give you two extremes. Um, one, if you are interested in avant-garde experimental music,
Mhm.
there is a good friend of mine named Roger Doyle, who is one of Ireland's foremost electroacoustic composers, who you can find on Bandcamp. If you want to listen to him, you can listen for free, or you can download. And he's been working he works obsessively. He just keeps producing music. He's been working on a project for the last couple of years called A Suite of Affections, which is based on Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. So he has people he knows, friends like the actor Aidan Gillen, for instance. People might remember him from The Wire, who lives here in Dublin, reading passages from Finnegan's Wake, and Roger has composed these amazing soundscapes around them. So that's somebody directly drawing on, you know, a particularly difficult piece of Irish literature and doing really interesting things. We go to the other end of the spectrum. There's a contemporary band called Fontaines DC, who are sort of, I mean, how I describe Fontaines DC, kind of a guitar-based post-punk, I guess, almost really, who draw on also traditional Irish music, but have really literary side to them. And you're listening to them, you think, God, that sounds like, you know, poet Patrick Kavanagh. That sounds, and you think it actually is. And they very much are rooted in the literary culture. Um, so there's two two ends of the spectrum.
Oh, wow. I mean, you just do everything. You're like totally the Renaissance man. Um, Marcia asks us, well, actually, before I go to that, somebody in the Q&A said that they found a link to the BBC book podcasts.
Oh,
I'll
good.
put that in the chat. But remember, this is not curated. It's somebody who's in the meeting. I have not
Okay.
had a chance to check it out. Okay. So Marcia asked this really good question. Is our current preoccupation with our phones and all they contain ruining the art of conversation in Dublin?
Yeah, that is a really, really good question. And I've been talking to a friend of mine who is in the University of Melbourne, and we're going to try and start a research project with a colleague of mine named Shane O'Mara, who is a neuroscientist. And what we're interested in is attention. What is happening to attention? And Shane has written a number of wonderful books, which I can highly recommend. He's a neuroscientist, but he writes for people like me who are not neuroscientists. And his last book, in fact, I'm going to reach up and pull it off my shelf here. I haven't gone away. His last book is called Talking Heads.
Oh,
And it is the new science of how conversation shapes our worlds. But it's about basically how conversation physiologically changes the brain, and he's able to draw on that kind of thing. And what we're interested in is actually what has happened to attention. So has kind of constantly scrolling, constantly flicking from one thing to another in a kind of algorithm-driven way, does that impede our ability to read things that involve longer narratives?
mhm.
And I think, I mean, one of the things I do is I chair the judging panel for the Dublin Literary Award, which is sponsored by Dublin City Libraries. It's the richest prize in the world for single work in English. And it's every year. So we look at 70 novels every year from around the world. And I love it. Oh, listen, you should know about this because the nominations for the Dublin Literary Award come from libraries. So any library in the world can nominate to the Dublin Literary Award.
I am going to look this up.
Yeah, Ashland Public Library. I want to see it on the list next year. Um,
It will be there.
yeah, yeah. But one of the things I've noticed is there is a tendency towards books that are written in kind of really short little bursts.
Mm.
And particularly amongst some of the younger writers, that these kind of little bursts of things. So I think writers are responding to that in the ways that they write. So simple answer, yes, these things have effects.
That is really, it's so true. We see it in libraries all the time that
Yeah.
people are like, I'm not taking out a book that's more than 400 pages.
Yeah.
Okay, so last question. Brenda asks, how did your book evolve in the 35 years it took you to put it all together and finally write and publish it?
I suppose when I said it took 35 years to write, I was being a little bit, how would you say, imaginative, because I didn't actually think of it as a book until I sat down to write it. And I had written on various other things. I'd actually just finished a book on Yeats, and I was talking to my publisher at Cambridge, and he said, what we really want is a book on Dublin as a literary city. And he originally thought of it as a collection of essays by different people. And I said, oh, I'd love to do that. I said, I'll do the whole thing. And then once I start writing it and I realized how I want to organize it, and I organized it around a series of maps,
Mhm.
I realized that in the time I'd been living in Dublin, what I'd really been doing was filling in maps. That every time I would walk down a street and I would realize, oh, such and such a writer lived there. Oh, that's where this is set. That's where this is set.
Mhm.
I was kind of filing it away. So I wrote it more quickly than anything I've ever written, and I had more fun writing it than anything I've ever written.
Mhm.
Because I found and it was funny thing is I wrote most of it during COVID. So I wrote it during lockdown. And I don't live in the city itself. I live about 20 miles west. I mean, the field I'm looking out at the moment is, it's very soggy, but a field full of soggy sheep. And I wrote most of it here using Google Street View. And I would kind of go down the street in Google Street View and I think, oh yeah, that's there, that's there, that's there. And so it took that long to build it all up.
Mhm. I love that aspect of your book, though, that map-centered way of doing it, so you can really go down streets and learn about Dublin at the same time while
Yeah,
learning about the writers. Just a really last quick question.
sure.
The book on Yeats, can you set, what was the title?
The book on Yeats I have it right here behind me, Yeats on Theatre.
Yates on.
Yeah, wait till I grab it because it has a great cover.
I did notice it on your shelf.
Yeah, I have it up there because it has such a great cover. Yeah.
Wonderful. Again, you are, like I said, the Renaissance person, just doing everything. I can ask you any question and you have an answer. I'm just so, so impressed.
Thanks very
And
much. Thank you.
so thank you again for doing this. Thank you for everybody who's been here and asked your wonderful
Yeah.
questions. I will send out a recap email with all of the information, including that crime fiction
Yeah, I'll send you that
talk that
link.
you sent. Chris, I expect I will have you back again next year when your next book comes
Sounds
out.
like fun. Sounds like fun. Good, good. And I expect a nomination from Ashland in the Dublin Literary Award.
I'm gonna look it up and I'm gonna start like thinking, what can I nominate? I'm gonna come up with something really like obscure and it'll be super fun for you to read.
Good, 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 good. Okay, great. Listen, and thank you to everybody for coming, showing up on a Saturday morning. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, I hope you all had a good cup of tea with us. So have a wonderful day. Chris, I'll be in touch and I
Thanks
hope
very
you
much.
all get out there and read Chris's book because they're amazing.
Thank you very much, Mina. It's very generous. Thank you.
Yep. Have a great
Bye-bye.
day, everyone.
Bye bye.